Well, welcome, an intimate but devoted group. If you're not already a fan of Novelene Ross, you're about to become so. I'm Patricia McDonald, director of the Wichita Art Museum, and pleased that we have such a nice showing of people for, I'm not sure what day this is, in our 80, around the WAM in 80 days, as we were thinking of different kind of activities and presentations and talks that would fill our 80-day marathon this fall, acknowledging our 80th anniversary. Novelene, you can blame me. I am the person that thought, you know, we need to bring our former chief curator, Novelene Ross, back to talk about our wonderful Tom Otterness sculpture, Dreamers Awake. It was a number of years ago when I was working in town at the Ulrich Museum. I heard Novelene give a presentation on this sculpture that was stupendous, absolutely stupendous. And I know in a community we can't all make it to everything, and regardless, it was a good number of years, and I want to hear this talk again. And so we reached out to Novelene, and she wonderfully said yes. So already acknowledged Novelene, former chief curator at the Wichita Art Museum, but actually she was here for a number of decades. We won't count how many. And she operated in many different kind of roles, as in the education department. She was interim director, I think maybe more than once, I'm not sure. And ultimately, she really led the intellectual depth, focused on the visual arts in this museum for a good number of years and did wonderfully, has written masterfully about the collection overall, the history of Elizabeth Novice, individual objects, and you're in for a treat this afternoon with her talk on Dreamers Awake. She was the curator who worked with the artist Tom Otterness to bring this incredible piece to Wichita and to the Art Museum. So here we have it from the horse's mouth, Novelene Ross.
Oh, thank you, Patricia, for such a lovely introduction. You know, I am so happy to be here and to be talking about a work in the collection that I love. And I believe that more people in Wichita are going to discover this work and find some of its mysteries and jewels in its new setting. How about that new garden, sculpture garden? How many have been there? How many have been through the sculpture garden? Fabulous. Well, then you know what I'm talking about. I am so pleased to have been asked to participate in the museum's 80th anniversary celebration, and also to see this very complex, monumental sculptural work that often causes controversy and certainly causes people to scratch their heads, that I am so happy to see it in an appropriate setting, and also to see so many other wonderful sculptural pieces from the collection that I had previously, even though as curator I cared for them, I was not perhaps totally in love with them. And one of the reasons was they weren't shown well. And now, having some works come out of the collection storage and find a new home is just tremendous, because now people can see them at their best and enjoy the wealth of, or some of the wealth of, the Wichita Art Museum collection. Okay, I want to take a look. Now you'll see these photographs were taken in 2008, before anyone conceived of a garden. So we're looking at these very stark we're looking at these figures against a stark background. And you really may be puzzled about their coming together, how they relate to one another, what is happening here. Have any of you had that question from the public? Okay, how many of you have that question yourselves? Okay, lots of people. Well, I think Tom would not be totally unhappy by that response, and I'll get to that point a little later. But right now, I'll take the role of a docent, and as your teacher, I'm going to ask you questions, and I hope you'll give me some feedback so we can kind of build on that. First of all, I'd like someone to just describe for me the most prominent figure in the composition, the vertical figure holding a weapon or an instrument, a tool. Somebody want to try that?
It's big.
Oh, come on. Please, yes.
Well, being of a certain age, what he's holding to me is a sickle.
Yes.
And there's so many things, that's the controversy for me.
A sickle.
And what in the world does it mean? And is this a man or a woman? Big, monumental, yes.
Yes.
And black.
Black, yes, the color is a prominent thing. And I'm sure that the majority of you are well aware that bronze, these are works of cast bronze, and the patina is black. But the patinas are not limited. The patinas for bronze can range from a very shiny gold through browns, and it can be matte or glossy. And so the artist who's done sculptural works in other patinas previously has definitely chosen black. So that the color is significant, and we can think about that. And you say you can't tell whether it's a man or a woman, so
I'm not sure.
it's a rather androgynous figure, correct? It does, for example, we don't have flowing hair to suggest that it's a woman.
Nor are there breasts.
The breasts are evident, the nipples are evident, but that could easily be the chest of a male, right? And the only indicator would be the slit between the legs to suggest the vagina. So we can come and say, well, with a reference to that organ, it's probably a woman. Does it look like an ordinary human being? Take a look at the toes, the number of toes. Is it proportioned? How's it proportioned? It's naked, isn't it? Suggests a reference. Where have you seen, or what is the tradition of the naked human form in public sculpture? Can you give me some background about that? Sir, how about you? A sculptor?
Actually, the whole time you were talking about that, Novelene, I just had my granddaughters, 6 and 3, out here last Friday, and the oldest granddaughter calls it the broken baby doll.
The broken baby doll. That's interesting. Is it
I mean, they
because
loved
of
it. They didn't have
the
any.
plump body?
Yeah,
Maybe?
I think the girth of the piece and the composition is, it's actually, it looks like a small body here. If you brought it back down, it would look like actually it's a large version of a small body.
So it doesn't look like a fully mature woman?
Correct.
Yes, okay. Or think about black tribal sculpture from Africa in which ancestors are represented, the genitals and the secondary sex characteristics are the most significant features of those figures, because we're talking about the ancestors who generated us or generated the various layers of the tribe. So these are not progenitors. We don't have here a woman who is being singled out as a person who's responsible for bringing children into the world. That's not quite what the
fertility goddess.
yes, fertility. Okay, we don't have maybe fertility as the principal feature. What does immediately seize one's attention? How about you, ma'am? Would you?
There's no arm, you mean?
Okay, one arm is missing. What happened to that arm? Do you have any notions at all? What would cause a full-grown, healthy individual to lose an arm? What are the kinds of things that would lead to that?
Somebody cut it off. The sickle.
Somebody cut it off. Okay, what would you say? War? Okay, that's one excellent reason. There's war, there's accidents, there's combat. I mean, it could be combat for sport, be a blood sport, but there's so in a violence, we have got a very prominent suggestion of violence. And someone mentioned the sickle is also, that is her only attribute, isn't it? We have this sickle, yes?
Well, you know, I just did a tour yesterday with high school students, and we spent a lot of time at this sculpture, and we did a writing activity where they spent about 10 minutes interacting with this sculpture. So, and that was before we had a dialogue about it.
Mm-hmm.
And what high school students are picking up on is very different from what we're talking about.
Okay.
They are picking up on money and the symbolism of money and corrupt power based on money. They never talk about any of the nudity or
Right,
any of
that
that.
doesn't strike them then, that doesn't.
So what's really interesting is for high school students, what they're zoning in on is the symbols of money and power in this and what that means.
Okay, for that, I'm not sure that I wouldn't get that immediately from this figure, but looking at the fallen figure, the male, and the little figures, right? Let's see what we have there. Okay, we have one vignette is of a group of small figures, 4 figures, carrying off, it looks to me like they're carrying off a footprint, that they're carrying it away. They're walking away from the big figure. Who owns the footprint? Whose footprint is that?
The little dude's pointing to the owner. The little guy in the top right, he's pointing to the owner of the footprint.
Okay. You think it's the standing woman. It could be her footprint. Certainly not one of theirs. Too big. Okay. Let's look at another one. All right. What does that central figure there? A small figure who's standing on an object in the fallen giant's hand. Describe that one.
Mr. Moneybags.
Its captor's been dismembered.
Well, there's a dollar sign up there.
There's a dollar sign on his head, on the head. And what is the head shape? It's a money bag. And so that would suggest that where the thinking instrument should be, there's money bags. All right? Then, does that figure remind you of any
Monopoly.
image in popular culture?
Also reminds you of the Monopoly game.
Yes.
And you also, he's very well dressed. He's got a coat, he's got a tie, and he's got the money.
He got vest, and so he is like the Monopoly man that is always brought in by the newspaper when there is some column about the Wall Street bandits or something or other.
But he's also under lock and chain.
Yes, he's got that ball may be what he is chained to. Okay, there's certainly reference to money. Tell me, is that figure and the other figures, are they related to the large standing figure and the small one? I mean, the fallen man and the standing woman, are they related to them?
No, because the other ones are inquisitive about everything that they're finding.
Right, they are two different species of being. And is either of the species representative of realistic men and women? Well, we get pretty quickly to the supposition that these figures are symbolic, that they are a material embodiment of ideas, and there's some interaction going on here. The little people are pursuing their own ends, while the large figures seem to be frozen in time. They are caught, they are posing, but and they don't seem to be that aware of these small creatures crawling about them. Okay. Thank you for helping me along in the introduction. This is a portrait of the artist, Tom Otterness, in his studio in Brooklyn, and he's standing next to a couple of plaster casts which are going to be translated into bronze. The idea of a couple, mom and dad, king and queen, the more you know of his work, you'll find that that is a very prominent theme. He comes back to it again and again in many different forms, examining the relationship of the couple. Tom is a product of the 1970s in New York City. He was born in Wichita. His parents were second-generation Norwegians who were born in the farming country of South Dakota. The parents met and married there. And then later, there was a move to Wichita, and Tom was born here, and he grew up here and went to school at Southeast High School. And so he was really a part of our community for his youth, his formative years. And then right after high school, he left for New York City. And he had a scholarship to the Art Students League, but he didn't follow up on it. He just leapt out on his own. And as I was speaking with some of the audience earlier, that was a particularly fertile time in arts innovation and creativity in New York. There were just hundreds of young people, musicians, dancers, playwrights, aspiring sculptors and painters, and they were all poor. They didn't have a lot of money. They were all there to seek their fortune in the arts, and they were living in the Lower East Side and in Soho. And so together, all of them there, the whole place crackled with energy. They were willing to take on the world. And as far as the visual artists were concerned, those of Tom's generation and of his particular bent of mind, they were interested in breaking the rules, destroying the heroic ideals of modernism, and pursuing the past that came to be labeled postmodernism. Of course, that term applies to a certain movement in literary criticism and elsewhere, but it had a certain meaning also for the visual arts in New York in the 70s. And I just want to read some notes that I took from a definition of postmodernism. I perused several on the internet. And here are some of the things that were said. And this is talking about visual artists. Their work, it was said, was ironic. It was playful. It was a deliberate mixing of the high and low hierarchies of art, so meaning that artists might draw their inspiration from the old masters, from the Renaissance, or from pop art, so that you would especially you will see in Tom's work the integration of pop art characters with figures or ideas inspired by a more formal art. And postmodernism was about undermining concepts of authenticity and originality. There was more emphasis upon image. There was a lot of emphasis upon spectacle. So you might which led to performance art. And certainly there was a very strong emphasis on feminism and diversity. The women artists really powerful, controversial women artists were emerging, and they were letting their male colleagues know that it's not only men who can be artistic geniuses. So even a male artist like Tom paid more attention to the role of the female in world history, but especially world mythology. Also, there was a reaction against the idea that great art only came from the art of the white races. There was great art from Asia, from Africa, from many other cultures apart from the modern West. And there was also a reaction against the idea that a work of art has one single important meaning that is determined by the artist himself, herself, at the inception of the work. And it's up to you, the audience, to find out what that one meaning is. Maybe you'll have to read or something, read up on art history or something. But they reject that idea. For them, a work of art lives within its cultural, its geographic, its social circumstances. And it may have multiple meanings, multiple implications. And so what one gets out of it is in part due to what one brings to it. When you look at those figures, you're making associations. What does a sickle mean to me? You know, and he's not going to tell you, oh, the sickle is a reference to communism and to the Cold War. No, he'll say, well, you're quite, it's legitimate to come to that idea. It's there, but it's not the only idea that's there. A work of art should have, in the postmodernist mind, layers of meaning and remain ambiguous, because as in reality, there is no one final answer. There is no one final reality that works for everyone in this universe. And art, like life, is ongoing. It's a process of change, of interaction, of a conjunction of maybe unequal forces. And the artist can bring this to life and can actually engage the viewer. You're using your mind, your background, your emotions, approaching a work that has multiple implications, and you're letting it speak to you in a way that you're taking those associations and you're congealing them into an experience that moves you. Okay, well, so that gives you Tom's the context of creativity. He worked with a group of innovative artists. Some were filmmakers, some were painters, some were theater people, et cetera, They formed an organization that they called CoLab, or Collaborative Projects, and they formed their organization in 1978 and started holding exhibitions in unconventional places. In Times Square was one of their most famous venues. So he is this confrontational, ironic, and very satirical artist. Okay, and he was called by one New York critic in the New York Times. He was called the world's best public sculptor. Well, that may not hold true, that may not have been true at all. But it is interesting to note that he aimed for public sculpture. It was not, he wanted sculpture that would be put in public places and that would engage a general public audience. Okay. Just want to mention some of his achievements. In the U.S., Otterness has completed at least 36 public commissions, including Life Underground of 2004, which was his celebrated multi-figural bronze sculpture installation for the New York Metropolitan Transportation Agency at the 14th Street station on the 8th Avenue subway lines. Now, in New York City, you'll encounter Tom's work in the subways, in parks, on the streets, in playgrounds. He really does inhabit New York City. But he's also received international commissions for public plazas in Germany, in Toronto, Canada, and Seoul, South Korea. And he has done a large public park in, I'm going to murder this name, Scheveningen in the Netherlands. And his most recent public work, called Creation Myth, is a gateway park for the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester, New York, and was dedicated in 2013. And he currently is a part of a group exhibition in New York City in St. John the Divine. The cathedral is sponsoring an exhibition called The Value of Food, and it focuses on themes of worldwide hunger and need. And Tom's big sculptural composition titled The Tables is on display there, as is a new composition of about 86 individual plaster casts, which range from 12 inches to over a yard in height. And it's probable, I've learned, that those pieces will remain the property of the cathedral. So he's an active New York international sculptor. And the piece that we own, The Dreamers Awake, he considers one of his most important works. And that group composition, the standing figure and the broken recumbent figure surrounded by the little people, is a central motif in this much larger sculpture called The Tables. It is what I would call the mythic center of that piece, and I'm going to show you more of it. This, by the way, is a small figure of one of the dreamers, the female dreamer, that appears on the tables. And the tables is this gigantic arrangement of picnic tables. The 3 tables are put together. They're about 38 feet in length, and they're over life size for adult males. So if a man about 6 feet tall went up to the picnic table and sat down on the bench, his feet would dangle. He wouldn't touch the ground. So he would get, and Tom wanted people to sit at these tables and observe all the little sculptures on top. And the idea was, in the scale, for the viewer to feel a little bit like Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack having stumbled in to the giant's castle and isn't really, may not be welcome there, or is a stranger there, is an observer. Okay. Now we're looking, here's an aerial view of the tables with its 3 different sections, but I have to say it's not yet fully installed. These photographs were taken for a catalog illustrating the work of the tables before it went on a world tour. And so we're actually looking at it as it's kind of half completed. The idea was, in Tom's mind, was to give us the whole spectrum of a civilization, to go from nature to industry. There's nature at one end of the tables, the one that's closest to us here at the bottom. Then in the center, he called it urban reality. It was a focus on the city. And then the distant one was industry. And you're just seeing figures with a lot of space around them. But when the installation is complete, that tabletop is crawling with figures. And they are eating, they're fighting, they're loving, they're robbing and stealing. There's just all kinds of just sort of human events taking place. And there's terrific precedent, maybe not in sculpture, but certainly in painting, for this kind of approach to the human spectacle. The painting that I'm showing as an example is by the Dutch artist Hieronymus Bosch, done in the early 16th century. This particular painting is titled The Hay Wagon, and it's a triptych in the collection of the Prado. And it is a fable, a story about good and evil. It's rather, we could say, it's a morality play. It shows the great hay wagon of life, and it's based on a Flemish proverb that the world is a hay wagon from which each one takes what he can. So it is a focus, especially in this central scene, on contemporary human society as Bosch is analyzing it and revealing its 7 deadly sins. He shows instances of vanity, of lust, of robbery, of murder, and there's all this striving, this getting. There's a continual torment of struggle to be better than the next one, to get all you can. And then this earthly kingdom is framed on either side by the Christian conception of, on our left, paradise, and on our right, hell. So it is a spectacle describing all of life's sufferings and corruptions and struggles, and everything is occurring simultaneously, and you can work your way through the painting and dwell on any aspect of human destiny. It's rather an attempt to describe the moral cosmos of human life. Well, that's pretty monumental. I'm sure Tom didn't think of himself as rivaling Bosch, but what I'm saying is there's, in certain eras and styles of the great tradition of Western art, there's plenty of precedent for what he attempted in the tables. And the most delightful thing is there's precedent in Kansas for what he attempted. Tom was a great fan, is a great fan of folk art, of outsider art, of untutored art. And one of the most famous folk art sites in the whole of the U.S. is here in Kansas, and that's the work called the Garden of Eden, which is at the home of Samuel Perry Dinsmore in Lucas, Kansas. How many of you been there? Yeah. Take a road trip. Don't miss it. If you're living in Kansas, you really owe it to yourself to see this fantastic, divinely naive sculptural rendition of the book of Genesis. What Dinsmore, who was himself a veteran of the Civil War and a farmer, a genuine populist, a man who really raged against the oppression of the working man, the farmer, the guy who's supplying the food, the lifeline of society, and yet it's the bankers, it's the lawyers, it's the politicians. They're all after him and want to squeeze the life out of him, want to take away his livelihood for their own sake. Well, he works his populist politics into the story of Genesis. And so as you go, Adam and Eve welcome us into the Garden of Eden over on, right there. And there's a grape arbor that covers that in the right season. But he introduces characters that are of his own imagination. We will, as you go through the garden, you're going to find little side commentaries, one of his favorites is "The world is dog eat dog," and he uses a Civil War soldier. He shows a Civil War soldier aiming a gun at an Indian, and the Indian in turn is aiming an arrow at a wild animal. I think it may be a wolf or something, and then the wolf is sneaking up on a fox, and a fox is after a cat, and a cat is after a bird, and the bird is after a worm, and the worm is after a leaf. So he too, like Bosch, is taking on the moral universe as he experienced it and interpreted it. Here's one of the famous works from that big composition, and it's one that particularly inspired Otterness, as we'll see in looking at some details of the tables. There is Lady Liberty wrapped in a flag. She's being attacked by a big fat spider. The spider, Dinsmore portrayed, or he saw it as the embodiment of the trusts. You know, all these robber barons who owned the whole of one industry and all its facets, and they were able thus to charge what they wanted and squeeze money out of the ordinary man. And it was Roosevelt, the hero, Teddy Roosevelt, who broke up the trust. Well, Dinsmore says, well, here's what's going to break up evil. It's Adam and Eve with the ballot. And they're sawing off this branch or whatever it is that's holding that spider next to Liberty. So he's saying, well, we are our own heroes. The common man and woman, we've just got to vote. Well, so you see there's this drama, the drama of good versus evil. And that's something, oh, there it is. There's labor crucified by the preacher, the banker, the lawyer, the doctor. So that, oh, there's one of the cat pursuing the bird. Now back to Tom's tables. There is he took in that idea, and his figures, many of his figures have much closer affinity stylistically with Dinsmore's work than they do with that of a great painter like Bosch. Here's the table, a close-up of a vignette of the table devoted to nature. And he shows a big sort of oval-shaped whale, it looks like, emerging from these doors, what do you call them? The Bombay doors on a plane. So there's a reference to a kind of dual reference to animal and to technology. And in the boat, there is a man and a woman trying to reel that whale in. And there may be certainly a reference to Jonah and the whale, or to Moby Dick. There's an awful lot of references connections that we could make. But you see very clearly it's a couple, Adam and Eve, the essential man and woman who are fighting this battle. Then we see also on the table of nature a group of animals, very curious, open creatures who are puzzled. Whoops, let me go back, who are very puzzled by their confrontation with human technology. This big, fat, very old-fashioned, looks like a dial telephone. Okay. Then in the central image, there are all of the corruptions and greeds of the big city. There is there's a four-story building, an apartment building that is that provides for the storage of money. And there's Humpty Dumpty, I guess the owner of the building, on top, fiddling away. He's not worried, like Nero in Rome, not worried about the collapse of his dwelling. And Tom makes reference to the differences in economic status and class in this building. He shows some figures in tuxedos and evening gowns. They're the elite, and then we have figures in workman's clothing climbing up ladders on the outside, trying to keep the building from falling down, while there's a group of nefarious folks over here trying to pull it down. And there's an iron fence around this enclave of the elite, but it is being breached by robbers. And the police here are doing their best to fend off the robbers. They've got a huge gun here that it's a life-size, on the tables, it looks like the life size of a handgun, but it looks like they're pulling a big cannon up to fight the robbers. Right down here we have a figure with a sickle, a standing figure, so we know that he's brought the dreamers into his composition. There's, when you see these round balls that maybe look like cannonballs, they're also the seed, the droppings of the spider. She's spreading poison throughout the city, and she's found in jails, she's found in factories, she enters into neighborhoods. This poison, this evil, invades everything. And you remember that Dinsmore portrayed evil, the truss, as a dangerous, greedy, destructive spider, and that is also Tom's embodiment of evil. It could be the Soviet state, the threatened takeover of our society by communism. There are enough references within the table as a whole to see that conflict, but there are a great many more conflicts. Conflicts between the haves and the have-nots, violence in the streets, the corruption and venal sins of the whole world. And his central table has got a trough here that he actually, when the tables are fully assembled, there is a stream of water that runs along this canal. And if you look closely, you'll see fragmented bodies of various of the little people that have presumably fallen in to the canal and drowned. And hanging above the tables is this cracked globe, an image of the besieged, damaged, decaying planet Earth. And atop the planet is a little person garbed as the harbinger of death with a scythe in its hand. And let's see, right. Remember there's a cord, a rope, a pulley holding that globe in place. Well, there's a couple of mean streeters who are down here sawing that cord in two. So we are reminded about the uncertainty and fragility of life, not only of our individual persons, but of the entire planet. And in that vicinity, we see this is where the dreamers have appeared. And the fragmented figure we can see more clearly in this photograph than in mine of our outdoor sculpture. But you see there is the head, there's an arm, there's a leg, there's big hand, there's a foot, and most importantly, there's one internal organ, the heart. And a plant grows from that heart, and it is a lotus bud. Now, when I first saw this composition, I thought of things I had studied in art history, specifically of the sculptural collections in the Vatican and in the National Museums of Rome. Because when you go into the courtyards of those great collections, you will frequently find fragments of a former statue gathered together, and all the pieces won't be there. There'll just be a few that archaeologists were able to recover. And there's a colossal statue, it's fragments in the courtyard of the Vatican, and there's this huge head with some sort of god or a super emperor or something. And there's a big foot, there's a giant foot, and there's a hand that belonged to that sculpture. And the hand is uplifted like this. And it's really startling. You can see, wow. And I'm sure that images like that influenced his depiction of a fragmented being. It's like, and then that should bring to our mind, these pieces maybe belong to a statuary of statues of heroic beings. Now, who else do we make these big, monumental, colossal statues of but our heroes, our emblems of virtue and valor and good? So we begin to think, yes, what are we looking at? There's another picture of the globe and he's looking at his watch. Is it time? Then, at the tables, going around the edge of the tables, there are settings, service settings, and so with urban reality, you may see the penny being divided, and it's intended for the gods or the giants, but the little people are there taking what they can get. Then there's this serving set on the table dedicated to nature, and it may be referring to dinner devoured or maybe to the disappearance of natural species. And yet there are some sweet notes in this universe, and one is, again, a reference to couples. Inside this teacup, there is a loving couple, man and woman, Adam and Eve, a suggestion that there is real, true affection and love in life. I was showing the contrast between Tom's lovers and those you often see on Hindu temples, which suggests, of course, the gods, that it is only through physical love, this real experience of ecstasy that the human can come close to, or begin to come close to, an understanding of true universal love. Okay. Well, back to my dreamer. I felt she was so magnificent, so serene and heroic. I was immediately drawn to the beauty of this figure. And in the catalog of the tables, you can find sketches showing Tom's process of evolving his characters for the tables. And the standing figure with the sickle has, in some cases, the sickle and a severed head and a funnel on top, and so he's drawing, and it's a female figure standing on a male figure who's dropped the hammer, and so he's running through ideas here. Another one, kind of a close-up of that image, and this particular figure is a reference to the image of the goddess Kali in Hindu mythology and art. And in Hindu art, we often see Kali depicted as a black figure with weapons in her many hands, and she's often seen dancing on top of the passive body of a male god Shiva, or here she seems to be a second embodiment of Shiva's consort. Okay, let me tell you a little background about Kali. Isn't it the internet wonderful? You can just look up these things and answer so many questions. Kali, and she's not a major Hindu figure. She's most popular in the south of India, and she's Kali, Sanskrit for the black one, the forces of time and death, and she is known as the destroyer. But she's not known as an evil person who comes in and wrecks your home and your society. She's known as, in a positive light, as a destroyer who goes after all of the evil and decay that surrounds our lives. And without her, without the person who attacks that decay and corruption and transforms it, we're not going to have new life. So we can see in Tom's drawings that he is thinking specifically of Kali, and that no doubt influenced his choice of the color, the black one. And yet, for so many people, then the black might be the bad guy. There are the white hats and there are the black hats. But the postmodernists want to remind you, hey, your world, your associations aren't the only ones. This is a big, diverse world, and we live in a cosmic framework of many cultures and eras. But all in all, we meet again and again the struggle between good and evil. Now, what am I looking at? Oh, it's 2:00. Oops. Here's some other images of the scythe. It is a very innocent agricultural tool. That's where one might think of it first. The communists don't own it. They just adopted it for their purposes. Why can't somebody else adopt it for his purposes? Okay, here's another, it's an interesting preparatory drawing. This is again when he's exploring ideas for the dreamers, the standing woman, the fallen man. You can see, oops, it's his couple again, Mom and Pop. Mom and Pop communism? Well, sort of. I think that it really drains it of any terror or threat to see this background. But take a look at the face of the standing figure. That the eyes are closed. That is a serene, meditative face, a face that suggests one filled with the energy of inner life. Here's another contrast of the female dreamer head and a Buddhist head. Postmodernists were interested, like the early moderns, in the primitive. Here's John Flanagan from our collection, the head of a woman done in an archaic rather than a classical Greek style. Here's Jose de Creef's Maya, the beautiful black stone with its contrast of polished and textured surfaces, which you'll also find in the Dreamers. Here's an interesting contrast, body types, the body type of, there are many cultures in which a figure might be presented as a plane, as sort of the body is broad, but if you looked at it from the side, you'd see it was kind of thin. So there, and Tom did at one time, his day job was working in a museum, the Historical Society Museum, and living with ancient, non-Western art collections. So here's the man, the fallen man, also eyes closed, but it's not serene, it's a very troubled face. And there are the little people who are kind of assaulting them, maybe not. There's a source for the fallen man is from popular art, from popular representations of Gulliver's Travels. Of course, Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels and A Modest Proposal, was himself an incredibly ironic and fierce, savage critic of social mores of his time. So he portrays ordinary society as Lilliputians, and Gulliver, the carrier of reason, the knowledge of the Enlightenment, is seen in contrast to the Lilliputians who don't know half the time what they're doing or what they ought to be doing. Okay, and so we get the little people are designed rather as to be seen as Lilliputians. And Lilliputians are always greedy, they're always on the take, and here they are running off with a footstep, which might be, here we see wonderful confusions of male-female attributes, the rugged boots, the cigar, and the top hat on the full-breasted woman, and then the flip-flops, Minnie Mouse shoes on a male figure with a funnel on his head. There's a bandit caressing a gun, sitting on the severed foot of a fallen dreamer. Just to remind you of a source for a footprint, that the Buddhapada, or the footprints of Buddha, it's said that when Buddha achieved enlightenment and he rose up from his meditation and stepped forth on the earth, his presence on earth left its evidence in his footprints in stone. So some in places there are thought to be natural footprints, but then there's also sculptures of the footprints, which are known as Buddhapada and kept within the temple, and offerings are brought to them. So the footprint is a reference in itself to a mythic, moral image, to the evidence of great thought, great minds, and goodness on earth. But we reach then, again, our final composition by Otterness. Now that we've gone through some of the background and associations of the pieces, would you be willing, I hope you will be, to offer some observations on the group, the compositions? Barbara?
New life is always there. In midst of destruction, and the lotus to me indicates that out of all of this destruction there will be new life.
Right. It could be that if this image is a reference to a mythic creature like Kali, the arm could have been lost in battle with evil. And the man, her consort, he has fallen. He had been in battle too. The two of them are doing their best to keep that cycle of regeneration, of creation, of bringing forth the new going. But oftentimes they face terrible defeat, and we may not be able to depend on them forever to keep us together, to renew our lives. So, but yet, as you say, there is the heart from which a lotus grows. So out of this war, this violence, this conflict, and even in the midst of greed and robbery and deluded focus on material objects, there is always hope for the resurrection, for the renewal, for new life to come. So the sculptural group makes a great deal more sense when we view it as a symbolic composition that deals with the moral dilemmas of human life. And the fact that they are the giant figures are naked is a suggestion that these are universals. They are not dressed, so they do not relate to a particular time or place or culture. It is within every culture that there is this moral quest for ways to defeat our own worst flaws and to bring forth a better life. Well, anyway, that is my love of the work, and I continue to find it enchanting, and I love so many of the forms, and I love the cartoon figures and the fact that these colossal, monumental heroes are there, and that people can come and play on it. They can just feel like they are observers at this, or even participants at this morality play.
When
Anyway.
was he born? How old is he?
Pardon?
When was he born? How old is he? Plus or minus?
1952. Yes?
Don't you think that the title reiterates just what you've been talking about? To wake up,
Yes.
to be aware.
Yes, to become enlightened is to wake up. So there is the potential that we can wake up. And it's there. Of course, there's always the potential for total destruction. Will that planet fall, that cracked globe of the earth fall and break apart and end us all? I mean, that is as I say, it goes back to a kind of medieval morality play.
I'm curious for the docents that are here, because there's obviously docents. Have children ever seen the hope of that, or do they just see the destruction of it?
I don't know. Is there a docent who could answer that?
Is there any docent here?
Well, I think the times that we have gone over in the docent program and brought children around, I think that we always looked at the lotus and referenced the idea that this was rebirth. This was blossom. This was something coming out of the earth.
Very good. Wonderful. Well, I thank you all so much. I thank you for your patience and for your interest. And I'd like to invite any of those of you who want to, it's not mandatory, of course, to accompany me outside. We'll go through the living room and out the doors and look at the sculpture in its new setting, how glorious it looks there. But I do want to warn you that if you go outside, you can't come back in that door. It'll be locked. To get back into the museum, you'd have to walk around again to the front entrance. So just keep that in mind if you would like to go outside. But I do love the work so much in its new setting that it's great to reflect on it again. Thank you.